Leaders meet in China for a historic Central Asia summit. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The leaders of 5 Central Asian countries gathered in China's historic city of Xi'an on Thursday for a 2-day summit and one-on-one meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative proposed by President Xi during his visit to Kazakhstan in 2013. Over the past decade, Central Asian countries have become beneficiaries of the infrastructure and trade program. Strengthening infrastructure, trade ties and regional security are among topics on the summit's agenda. CGTN's Meng Shisheng has more in this report.
President Xi Jinping has a tight and fruitful agenda on the first day of the 2-day summit. He held 4 rounds of bilateral talks with the leaders of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. After each meeting, the heads of state signed important cooperative deals to strengthen their neighborly and friendly relations. President Xi stressed the China-Central Asian relationship has traveled a 31-year journey. It enjoys deep historical roots, solid political foundations, substantive cooperation, and extensive public support. And China is ready to work with Central Asia to build a community with a shared future, featuring everlasting friendship, solidarity, and mutual benefit. Leaders of Central Asia reiterated their support for the One China principle, and they praised the China-proposed Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. They expressed their willingness to enhance the depth, breadth, and scale of cooperation and expand their partnership in areas like the economy, trade, natural gas, connectivity, and cultural exchange. Central Asia also voiced their support for the Belt and Road Initiative launched back in 2013. As of the end of 2022, statistics show over 65,000 China-Europe freight trains had transported $300 billion worth of cargo, and nearly 80% of the total trips passed through Central Asia. I've spoken to business people from Central Asia who told me the freight trains offer a secure and reliable channel for trade and economic cooperation. The train service only costs 1/5 of air transportation and takes a quarter of the time required by shipping. Currently, China's civil aviation sector are working together with the Central Asian countries to develop an air Silk Road. This will bring more opportunities for cooperation in culture, business, and tourism. China has also been the largest or main trading partner of Central Asian countries for many years, and its trade volume has continuously hit record highs. In the process of combating extremist terrorist activities, China has carried out close cooperation with law enforcement agencies and judiciary institutions in Central Asia. China has become one of the main destinations and preferred countries for students in Central Asia to study abroad. The number of Central Asian students studying in China has rapidly increased after the COVID-19 pandemic. In-depth cooperation is clearly a valuable asset all sides cherish. President Xi Jinping emphasized that China will always be a trustworthy and reliable neighbor, partner, friend, and brother to Central Asian countries. Meng Xisheng, CGTN, Xi'an, Shanxi Province.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Gong is Vice President at the University of International Business and Economics. Sourabh Gupta is a resident senior fellow and senior Asia-Pacific policy specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. And also with us is Yersultan Zansetov. He is a senior expert in the China and Asian Studies program at the Institute for World Economics and Politics. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Gong, let me start with you. President Xi Jinping will be holding talks with the leaders of these 5 Central Asian countries. How would you characterize the relationship between China, the diplomatic, trade, and economic relationship between China and these 5 countries?
Well, I think China's relationship with these five countries has been, built on, very friendly interactions in all kinds of fields, particularly in business and in commerce. I think there are no fundamental conflicts of interest between China and any of these five countries. We are good neighbors, and I think particularly the trade route between China and Europe, this railways, a set of railways actually, as your program has mentioned, have benefited immensely these five countries. So I think, at a very fundamental level, we maintain very good relationships. And I think there are also a lot of potentials in terms of Chinese investment in bringing the infrastructures in these five countries to the next level, as well as interactions in other areas. For example, in tourism, I see a huge market, for example, for people to visit countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, which has a very long history of civilization. So all of these things would contribute to better relationships between the two sides.
Right, and John, there's also a security component to this, as our reporter was telling us in his report, and that China has been involved in making sure that this area is free of terrorism and is kept safe.
Yeah, so I think China shares with these countries for the concern of the spread of extreme radical Islam in China's Xinjiang area, autonomous region. We have seen in the past activities by these essentially terrorists. There are about 15 years ago, there was a series of terrorist attacks carried out by these people in Xinjiang. And now, of course, it's a much better situation, it's contained. So I think China and our neighbors all commonly share the interest that want to root out these terrorist attacks, which to some extent is associated with Al-Qaeda, for example, in the past, these extreme Islamic jihadists or extreme religious zealots, they're causing problems in China, as well as in our neighboring countries as well.
Yes, Sultan, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. As I said, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was originally proposed, as we heard, by President Xi in Kazakhstan in 2013. Now, if we look at the trade figures between these two countries, bilateral trade between China and Kazakhstan is worth $31 billion. That is a 24% increase from 2021. Here is Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev talking about the relationship with China. Let's listen.
We enjoy a very close relationship in so many areas. The overall trade between both states reached $31 billion. In this context, of course, China has shown itself as a very reliable partner. We are ready to develop as many areas of mutual cooperation as it's possible in the future. We welcome investments from China. We welcome businessmen from China. And I think that we'll be hosting them very well here in Kazakhstan.
So, Sultan, talk to us about the relationship between Kazakhstan and China and how you see it grow from here.
If we are talking about the relationship between China and Kazakhstan, we have to start from the very beginning. So China was one of the first countries that recognized the independence of my country, Kazakhstan. It was like in 1991. And the very important topic, if you are talking about the early age of relationship between Kazakhstan and China, is the borders. We are quite successful in settling all the possible disputes about the borders, and we have signed all the agreements about the borders in the 1990s. So that's a big success for Kazakhstan foreign policy. And ever since 1990s till now, our bilateral relationships were only developing, and now we are in the eternal comprehensive strategic partnership. So, and it is clear that after this summit, after this visit of Mr. Kassym-Jomart Tokayev to China, we can expect another level of bilateral relations. So it was already announced that more than 40 agreements on the China-Kazakhstan investment roundtable was signed, amounting for around like $22 billion US. So that's another step, that's another level now.
Sourabh, of course, China already has a relationship with these countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you expect this summit to build on that?
I think they just want to deepen ties of friendship and cooperation, particularly economic cooperation and also cultural interaction and cooperation at a more people-to-people level, so that there's deeper integration between the two sides. But I think for me at least, one of the most important points coming out of this summit is not just about that they are meeting and reaching these agreements, but the very fact of the timing of this summit. And the fact is that this summit is happening at the same time as the G7 summit is happening. And at the G7 summit, one of the key issues at that summit is, of course, about Ukraine. And this is a statement that China is making by hosting the Central Asian presidents in terms of supporting the territorial integrity of each of these Central Asian states in an implicit way, considering that many or some of these Central Asian states have significant Russian populations, and there is a certain analogy with the Ukraine situation. So I think it's a big statement being made in that regard. Remember, when President Xi made his first visit out after COVID, he went to Kazakhstan. And at this very point of time, again, when the G7 is happening, we have the Chinese special envoy meeting Mr. Zelensky. So there's a lot of symbolism out here in terms of the timing of this meeting, aside from just deepening these core ties of these ties of relationships with Central Asian countries.
John Gong, when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and how that is forming the basis for the relationship between China and Central Asia, where do you see the most potential for growth?
Well, I think the usual suspect, I guess, investment infrastructure. Even though reportedly the total amount of investment made by China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative in these 5 countries has amounted to about $15 billion. But still, I think it's a small number in the grand scheme of things. 5 countries combined is still a very sizable population. And I've been to Astana, I've been to Tashkent. It's very clear that there's still a lot of room for improving the infrastructure. So I think as people would expect that the Belt and Road Initiative projects are still mostly about building infrastructures in these countries. There's been talk about pipeline and also railway in that region connecting to China. These are projects involving a lot of money, and my hope is that these things would go forward smoothly. I do want to make a comment about the situation with respect to Russia. I think we have to be a little bit cautious about making the relationship China versus these 5 countries as sort of a substitute relationship for the relationship between Russia and these countries. I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, it's framed like this a lot, as I've seen in several Western media. But I think I do admit that. These countries do have a concern about, their territorial integrity in terms of if there is anything similar to what happened to Ukraine. But I think it's a little bit of a stretch of imagination. I think it's far from that. And I think China and Russia both understand that their operations or their existence in this region doesn't have to be us against them. I think China maintains good relationships with Russia as well as these 5 countries. I just want to be cautious about making that analogy to the Ukraine situation. It's not a good analogy in my view.
All right, Sourabh, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with whatever John said, and I wasn't trying to overemphasize that. And we have to remember, all the Central Asian presidents, all or most of them, were in Russia just 2 weeks or a week back for the Victory Day parade. So whatever their misgivings might be, they were there in Russia. And that's why also in my initial comments, I mentioned that China is trying to deepen its ties economically and culturally, but not strategically. China has been very, very careful that in terms of strategic relationships, Russia is number one in the region and will stay that way. And China is not planning to prod the bear in any respect in regards to that, because they know how to share the region and share the region to the benefit of the smaller states in the region. So I completely agree with John, but I do find a certain bit of symbolism in the timing in China trying to make certain statements. And I think those statements are valid and are important ones, because China has important roles to play in the world in many regards.
Yes, so Tom, what is your view on this, that, as Sourabh points out, there's something of a little bit of symbolism in this, considering the timing of the conference that's taking place right now, taking place at the same time as the G7, and his view that implicit in this is a recognition of the territorial integrity of these 5 countries.
Well, yeah, of course, this kind of opinions are, we can see this kind of opinions often like in the expert interviews on the news. But talking about territorial integrity, I would like to say that Kazakhstan is in quite a different situation than Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We are not trying to join NATO, or we are not trying to attract any kind of American or any foreign military bases in Central Asia. We are in the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia. We are in the same military bloc. So, of course, there might be some kind of speculations and some kind of fears, like what if similar things will happen in Kazakhstan, like what happened in Ukraine. But actually, if you look carefully to the foreign policy of Kazakhstan, we are not doing anything against Russia. We are not leaning against Russia, we're not joining the anti-Russia bloc. So actually, Kazakhstan is following a quite careful foreign policy. So I'm pretty sure that the situation is quite different.
When we look at some of the other developments internationally right now, Sultan, I mean, we look at the geopolitical divisions that we've been seeing. A lot of that has been, of course, generated by the crisis in Ukraine. There's also the lingering effects of the COVID pandemic. I mean, what kind of challenges do these pose?
Talking about the challenges, overall situation, in geopolitics, is quite challenging. Countries like Kazakhstan or any other countries in Central Asia, well, number one, we are landlocked countries. We don't have direct access to the oceans, to the the biggest transportation roads, like the sea transportation. We are quite dependent on transport corridors, both in all directions, through Russia, China, and other countries. So we have to keep our good relationships with all of our neighbors. And number one goal for countries like Kazakhstan or any other Central Asian countries is transport corridors. Actually, that was one of the big topics during the meeting between Mr. Kassym-Jomart Tokayev and Xi Jinping. Kazakhstan is trying to diversify its transport corridors, and one of the big topics now is the Trans-Caspian corridor, which is quite beneficial for China as well, since we know that war in Ukraine is not predictable. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and the northern corridors through Russia and Belarus is less and less reliable. So I'm pretty sure that there will be some kind of roadmaps or plans from the Chinese side as well about expanding the Trans-Caspian corridor.
John, the trade relationship between China and Central Asia, I mean, that is valued at $70 billion last year, and investments in Central Asia hit nearly $1 billion. Let's listen to 2 government ministers from 2 Central Asian countries on the impact that China's involvement is having in the region.
Railway construction has been planned between China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. I think it has huge potential, and it makes alternative sources and the search for alternative markets, as well as access to the sea, possible.
China is playing a very important role as a trade enabler, as a major investor in the entire Central Asian region. And projects that China is implementing in Central Asia are contributing to making the region more connected. We are not limited with just infrastructure. We can look at all various different avenues, including agriculture, power sector, healthcare, education.
So, John, listening to those two ministers, of course, the big focus is on transport infrastructure and communications. How important is the transport infrastructure for this region?
Well, it's pretty obvious that transportation is extremely important for these countries as they all landlocked countries. I just want to emphasize the importance of that railway. Actually, without that railway, trade cost is very high. And if you look at the original purpose of that railway, it's actually originating from a need for exporters in China, many of them actually American companies operating in China, to ship goods to a European market in a cost-effective manner and also in a timely manner. Now, the side benefit of that railway, the opening of the railway, is actually, in my view, really percolating down to these 5 countries, because all of a sudden the additional cost of transporting things out of that region into European market as well as into China, all of a sudden is coming down because of the railway. And I think this is a very good example of the importance of infrastructure. I think in terms of trade, what's fundamentally driving the growth is really the complementarity nature of trade between China and these 5 countries. I mean, these countries, it doesn't have a very large domestic market. That is why manufacturing typically is kind of difficult because of the limitation of the size of the market. But they're also very strong in agricultural products, in energy products. So I think the trade with China enables them to gain from trade with comparative. I mean, it's a classic comparative advantage story, right? Ricardo type of comparative advantage story. So I think that is the fundamental reason driving the cooperation between our countries. I think with some more investment from China, in addition to infrastructure, maybe manufacturing as well, that also adds more value to the kind of agricultural products, for example, these countries are producing, and adds value means driving economic growth and benefiting the local population. So overall, I think it's a very good economic story.
Yes, Sultan, China's ambassador to Kazakhstan, Zhang Xiao, he recently talked about Kazakhstan's role in the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's listen to him.
As a transit country for the BRI, Kazakhstan's transit potential has been released and developed like never before. Therefore, when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Europe Railway Express, and the Eurasian Land Bridge, we cannot ignore Kazakhstan, an important hub on this route. Of course, Kazakhstan has gained huge benefits from this process, creating many jobs for its people, building a large number of infrastructure facilities, and creating fiscal revenue and enhancing its visibility.
So, Sultan, as we can hear there's a lot of synthesis or synergy, rather, in the relationship, in the trade and aid relationship here, very much of a win-win scenario. How do you see it?
I totally agree with that. Actually, as you already mentioned, BRI was announced in Nazarbayev University in Astana in 2013. And in the year 2015, Kazakhstan has developed its own national strategy. It's called Nurlu Zhol. It was actually created to link with BRI. And ever since, we can see that the capacity of the railway transportation is increasing year by year. And more of that, Kazakhstan and China are trying to open the 3rd checkpoint for the railways on the border. So all of that is showing that the transport and transit capacity of Kazakhstan is increasing. And actually, Kazakhstan is, in my opinion, it's like the #1 country in Central Asia for China in matters of political cooperation, economic cooperation, and of course, in the matter of transportation. So we know that in the year 2022, the bilateral trade between Russia and China has almost reached $200 billion US, and most amount of those goods transported to Russia and back to China was going through Kazakhstan. So it says, like everything, we are one of the key partners of China, at least in the region.
Sourabh Gupta, of course, the United States is also seeking to engage more closely in the region. The United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he has been holding talks with all 5 of those countries that we are talking about. It's a sort of signal of Washington's desire to improve its relationships in the area. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it would be welcome if Washington comes up with something positive in terms of actually engaging these countries. As we've seen, not just only in Central Asia, but in many other places where Washington might think there are greater vital interests, like in the Indo-Pacific, the US has not been able to come up with anything resembling a really decent economic strategy to become a pole of attraction for these countries. And that is the same problem at this point of time still. I mean, what does Washington have to offer? It had those bases during the global war on terror in some of the Central Asian countries. I think since 2014, they've gone back. The Washington has not been a good stakeholder in terms of remedying what happened in Afghanistan. We know, I mean, the Biden administration left Afghanistan and not on the very best of terms. And there are fears that there's terrorism and spillovers that could radiate out from Afghanistan, including weaker terrorists and those sort of folks who are based in areas out there. And therefore, I mean, Washington has to rebuild its credibility. It can talk and say things, but really it comes down to actually delivering. I'm not sure there's much delivery going to happen. And until that time, I think I'm not thinking that the Central Asian countries are waiting with bated breath, hoping that something great is going to come out of this. And again, to bring back the Russia episode, if this is Washington trying to India itself to Central Asia because of what Russia might have done in Ukraine, I mean, that is not a strategy which has legs to it. And I don't think Washington should even consider the region in that context at all.
John, just one final point on the summit in Xi'an. It's, of course, 2 days that the leaders are meeting. It's a very high-level summit. What do you think the objectives are? What would the sides be hoping to achieve?
I think other than the economic deals we've been talking about, I think there have got to be some discussions about the war in Ukraine, how the 6 countries can sync up their positions and strategy. I think I think there's only one purpose for U.S. Secretary Antony Blinken's visit to these countries. That is to make sure that these countries don't play a role in helping Russia to evade sanctions, to make sure these countries don't ship any military, or according to his words, lethal assistance, I guess, or weapons basically to Russia. I think that's his sole purpose. That topic would, in my view, definitely be on the agenda in the discussions. All of these countries,
right,
China included, was somehow sort of portraying closer relationship with Russia, even though all of them have maintained that they are taking a neutrality position. But it's subject to a lot of criticism. So that's why I think these 5, 6 countries have to come up with strategies in dealing with that.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.